despite sharp criticism about rising civilian casualties from Afghan President Hamid Karzai. General Jones said on ABC's This Week that, quote, to tie the hands of our commanders and say we're not going to conduct airstrikes would be imprudent. In Afghanistan, meanwhile, University of Kabul students protested the U.S. strikes while mourning the dead. This is Esanuri, a student from the western Farah province where the bombings took place.
If this kind of action continues in Afghanistan, with no doubt there will be a nationwide uprising against foreign presence here. So if that happens, I don't think even US B-52 bombers would be able to stop a national uprising.
Residents of the two villages hit by U.S. bombs last week report 147 civilians were killed in the strikes, but U.S. officials have disputed this number. During a visit to Afghanistan last week, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates accused the Taliban of using civilians as human shields. He said civilian casualties caused by U.S. and coalition forces were accidental, but, quote, when the Taliban creates civilian casualties, it has been deliberate. Afghan doctors, meanwhile, say they've treated at least 14 patients with unusually severe burns. The Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission is investigating whether the U.S. Army used white phosphorus in its attacks last week. The U.S. military denies the allegation and has accused the Taliban of using white phosphorus on at least 4 occasions. 3 of Syed Barakat's children are being treated for burn injuries at a hospital in Herat.
When the bombing started, about 75 of us, including children and women, rushed and sheltered in an unoccupied house, which was bombed by the Americans, killing everyone except for 7 of us.
The increasing civilian casualties by U.S. airstrikes come on the eve of the deployment of an additional 21,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. Well, I'm joined right now by retired military colonel. He testified at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing last month, urging lawmakers to oppose President Obama's escalation in Afghanistan. Andrew Bacevich is professor of history and international relations at Boston University. He's a conservative historian and a Vietnam War vet who spent 23 years serving in the U.S. Army. He's the author of The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, and most recently, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism. It's just come out in paperback. 2 years ago, on May 13th, 2007, Andrew Bacevich's son was killed in Iraq. Andrew Bacevich now joins us from Boston. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program.
It's good to have you with us. Talk about this testimony you gave before Congress and why you spoke out against the expansion of war in Afghanistan.
Well, I was invited to testify by Senator Kerry and thought it was appropriate for me to accept the invitation. I have been deeply disappointed by the direction of U.S. policy in AFPAC, as the Obama administration chooses to call it, ever since President Obama was inaugurated. I know, as do others, that when he was running for the office, he promised to reorient the U.S. military effort from Iraq to Afghanistan. I had hoped that that was simply campaign talk to protect himself from the charge of being weak on national security, and therefore I regret that it turns out that he's serious on doubling down in Afghanistan and expanding U.S. military efforts in Pakistan. I think both of those are mistaken.
What do you think needs to be done right now?
Well, I mean, that is the core question, and I think you can come at that question at several different levels. I think the most important level, the most fundamental level, is that the Obama administration needs to revisit some core questions that it has thus far ignored. And what do I mean by that? I mean that in the wake of 9/11, the Bush administration, as it launched this so-called global war on terror, did so assuming that the United States possesses the capacity and also has a requirement to determine the fate of nations in the greater Middle East. And the Bush administration intended to begin this project of determining the fate of nations in that region by focusing on Iraq. It seems to me that the Obama administration has implicitly endorsed that notion that we can determine the fate of nations there, albeit its focus is on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think that that core issue needs to be critically addressed. Do we possess the capacity to determine the fate of a place like Afghanistan? Do we need even to make the effort? That is to say, do our interests require it? And I think the answer to both those questions is no. We don't have the capacity and we don't have the requirement. So what we need to do, first of all, I think, is ask fundamental strategic questions. Now, you can come at it at a second level, which is more the tactical or the operational level. And I think that's what brings you face to face with things like this U.S. policy with regard to airstrikes. You cited General Jones commenting that we can't tie the hands of our commanders. Well, Jones knows that we always tie the hands of our commanders. That is to say that we establish parameters, that certain things are permitted, certain things are allowed, certain resources are provided to commanders, and other things are not permitted and other resources are denied. We don't allow General McKiernan in Afghanistan to use nuclear weapons if he thinks it's necessary. And so the question is whether or not we're tying the hands of our commanders or establishing those operational parameters in ways that are smart. And frankly, the promiscuous use of air power in Afghanistan, and also I think in Pakistan with the UAV strikes, is not smart. It's counterproductive, and that also needs to be critically re-examined.
Afghan President Hamid Karzai strongly denounced the U.S. airstrikes on his country in an interview with David Gregory that aired Sunday on NBC's Meet the Press.
We have to be morally on a much higher platform in order for us to win the war on terrorism.
And do you worry that the U.S. has not met that standard?
The U.S.
Have they not met their own moral standard?
The U.S. has not met that standard in Afghanistan. The United States must stand on a much higher moral platform in order for us together to win this war.
Let me be clear about what you're saying. Are you suggesting that the United States is waging an immoral war in Afghanistan?
No, it's not immoral war. It's the standard of morality that we are seeking, which is also one that is being desired and spoken about in America. In other words, are we the same as the terrorists? Are we the same as the bad guys? Or are we standing on a much higher moral platform? Are we better human beings or not?
That's President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan on NBC Sunday. Andrew Bacevich, your response.
Well, I mean, if we are serious, then we understand that for policymakers, moral considerations are never other than a secondary issue. And it seems to me that the core question is, does the use of air power in places like Afghanistan make sense? Does it work? Is the cost-benefit ratio in the favor of the United States? And frankly, the answer is no. This most recent incident in western Afghanistan, where the reports are that we killed more than 100 civilians, even if we only killed 10, the fact of the matter is the report of having killed 100 is now well established, and it is that report which creates the backlash of anti-Americanism and plays into the hands of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. You know, in your intro, you cited, I think it was Secretary Gates saying that, you know, the Taliban kill civilians intentionally, we kill civilians, or when we do it, it's accidental. Well, you sort of want to say, give me a break. It may be unintentional, but to use air power in any significant way in a conflict of the type that we are waging in Afghanistan will inevitably result in the killing of non-combatants, and therefore will inevitably contribute to the rise of anti-Americanism and will work on behalf, in favor of the adversary. So it really seems to me that we're at the point where the reliance on that kind of firepower for this kind of a low-intensity conflict has become so clearly counterproductive that setting moral considerations aside, and I don't mean to do that because they don't matter, but setting moral considerations aside, pragmatically, the policy makes no sense.
We're talking to Andrew Bacevich, professor of history and international relations at Boston University. He's a Vietnam War veteran. His most recent book, now out in paperback, is The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism. We'll come back to our conversation with him in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Andrew Bacevich. He's professor at Boston University, professor of history and international relations. His latest book, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism.